A dance that changed everything. Spring 1944. The scent of blooming magnolias drifted through the warm Alabama air, mingling with the distant hum of warplanes soaring above the Tuskegee airfield. The town was alive with the echoes of patriotism, posters urging men to enlist decorated every storefront, and radios crackled with the latest news from the front. War had seeped into every corner of life, a shadow cast over every family, every conversation, every dream. But tonight, within the walls of the officers' club, the world felt different. The low murmur of voices blended with the rich, golden notes of a jazz band playing a lively tune. Soldiers in crisp uniforms laughed and twirled women in elegant dresses across the dance floor, their worries momentarily drowned in music, in movement, in the fragile illusion of peace. Sarah Whitmore stood at the edge of the room, her delicate fingers clutching a glass of lemonade. She had never planned to come tonight. The idea of a party, of laughter and dancing, felt almost wrong when so many men were leaving, some never to return. But her friend Ruth had insisted, saying, "Sarah, you need to live, even if just for one night." And so, here she was, wearing a soft lavender dress that hugged her slender figure, her dark curls neatly pinned, her hazel eyes scanning the room. She watched the couples twirling, some laughing, others lost in the kind of embrace that whispered promises of forever, even when forever wasn't guaranteed. She had just turned away when she felt it, the distinct, electric sensation of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head and met a pair of eyes across the room. They were deep, dark, and filled with something she couldn't quite place, kindness, intensity, and a quiet strength that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The man stood tall, his uniform immaculate, the silver wings on his chest gleaming under the chandelier's glow. His dark skin contrasted with the crisp white of his shirt, his posture exuding both authority and a certain unspoken gentleness. Sarah knew the rules of their world. Knew what society expected. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. He began walking toward her, his movements measured, confident, as if he had already decided that nothing, not the glances from the crowd, not the unspoken barriers, would stop him. When he reached her, he inclined his head slightly. "Would you care to dance?" His voice was smooth, rich, with the faintest trace of something, maybe the South, maybe something else entirely. For a brief second, Sarah hesitated. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what this meant. Dancing with a man like him, in a place like this, would not go unnoticed. But then, she looked into his eyes again, saw the quiet question there, the invitation, and without thinking, she placed her hand in his. "I would," she said. The moment their hands touched, it was as if the world around them faded. He led her onto the dance floor, his grip firm but careful, as if he already understood how fragile this moment was. The jazz band had shifted to a slower tune, a sultry melody that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. They moved in perfect harmony, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, guiding her effortlessly across the floor. "I'm Marcus," he said, his voice close to her ear as they swayed. "Sarah," she replied, feeling warmth spread through her as they turned in slow, deliberate circles. For the first time in a long while, she felt weightless. As if, just for tonight, she could forget the war, the uncertainty, the expectations of the world beyond these walls. They danced in silence for a while, their movements saying everything that words could not. She could feel the subtle strength in his touch, the way his fingers curled protectively around hers, the way his gaze never wavered from hers. And for the first time in her life, she understood the kind of connection that needed no explanation. But the world never lets such moments last. A sharp voice cut through the music. "Sarah." She turned, her trance broken, to see her father standing near the doorway, his face tight with disapproval. He was a well-known man in town, a respected businessman, and he had made his views on proper company very clear her entire life. A hush fell over the room. People stopped dancing. Eyes darted between her, Marcus, and the towering figure of her father. Sarah swallowed hard, her hand still in Marcus's, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the music anymore. Marcus's grip tightened ever so slightly, just enough to let her know, "I'm here." But he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "Come," her father said, his voice controlled, but the undercurrent of fury unmistakable. "Now." She looked at Marcus, her breath shaky. She wanted to say something. Apologize? No. That wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to tell him that she didn't regret it, that this dance had meant something, that it was the first time in her life she had felt truly alive. But she couldn't. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back, breaking the connection. The moment her hand left his, it felt as if something inside her had been severed. She turned and walked away, her father's firm grip closing around her wrist. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Because she knew, she felt, that Marcus was still standing there, watching her go. And in her heart, she knew that this was not the last time they would meet. Not by a long shot. A love that refused to die. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs as she followed her father through the double doors of the officers' club, leaving behind the music, the dancing, and the man who had changed something inside her in mere moments. The warm Alabama night wrapped around her, but she felt cold. Her father's grip on her wrist was tight, his knuckles pale from the force of his anger. He didn't speak as he led her through the streets, past the dimly lit buildings, past the town square where war posters fluttered in the evening breeze. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. It wasn't until they reached their home, a white-columned house that sat proudly on the outskirts of town, that he finally turned to face her. The porch lantern flickered, casting shadows across his face, deepening the lines of a man who had always carried the weight of reputation on his shoulders. "What were you thinking, Sarah?" His voice was low, dangerous. She swallowed hard, her pulse still racing. "I was dancing." "With him?" He spat the word like venom. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes." His expression darkened. "You know what people will say. What they'll think." Sarah clenched her fists. She had lived her whole life knowing what was expected of her, what kind of man she was supposed to marry, what kind of life she was meant to live. But for the first time, she found that she didn't care. "I don't care what people say," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Her father stepped closer, towering over her. "Then you are a fool." Sarah flinched, but she refused to back down. "Why?" "Because I danced with someone who made me feel," she stopped herself, her throat tightening. He shook his head, looking at her like she was a child who had spoken nonsense. "Because the world doesn't change for love, Sarah. You think it's just a dance, but men like him," he took a deep breath, as if to compose himself. "They don't belong in our world." Her stomach twisted. She had expected this reaction, but hearing it aloud made something inside her snap. "And what if I don't want this world?" she whispered. Her father's expression hardened. "You will forget about tonight. You will never see that man again. Do you understand me?" She didn't answer. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his graying hair. "Go inside. Now." She hesitated for just a second too long. "Now, Sarah." His voice left no room for argument. She turned on her heel and walked into the house, her hands trembling as she shut the door behind her. But even as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, even as she sat by her window staring at the stars, she knew one thing for certain. She would not forget tonight. And she would not forget him. The next day, Sarah woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window. A soft, steady rhythm that seemed to match the dull ache in her chest. The events of last night replayed in her mind, the warmth of Marcus's hand in hers, the way he had looked at her, the feeling of being completely seen for the first time in her life. She had no idea if he would still want to see her after the way she had walked away. But she had to find out. Throwing on a simple blue dress, she tucked her curls under a scarf and slipped out of the house before her father could notice. The town was quiet in the early morning mist. Most men had already gone off to war, leaving only women, children, and the elderly behind. She walked quickly, her heart racing with each step. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to find Marcus. The airfield. It was the only place that made sense. The airfield. Sarah stood at the edge of the Tuskegee airfield, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rows of sleek, silver planes lined the tarmac, their noses pointed toward the horizon as if eager to fly. Young men in flight suits walked briskly between hangars, preparing for whatever mission awaited them. And then, she saw him. Marcus stood near one of the planes, deep in conversation with another pilot. His posture was as strong as she remembered, his uniform pressed, his silver wings gleaming in the morning light. For a moment, she hesitated. Would he be angry? Would he think she was foolish for coming? Before she could talk herself out of it, he turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without hesitation, Marcus excused himself from the conversation and walked toward her. Sarah, he said, his voice laced with both relief and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. I had to see you, she admitted, breathless. A slow smile played at the corner of his lips. I wasn't sure if you would. She looked down, unsure of what to say. I wanted to. But my father. His smile faded slightly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. I figured as much. She met his gaze again. But I don't care. I don't want to spend my life doing what's expected of me. Marcus studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. I leave tomorrow, he said quietly. Her stomach dropped. Tomorrow? He nodded. Deployment. They need pilots overseas. The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Tomorrow. The world was at war, and men like him were sent to fight battles that didn't promise a return. Sarah's throat tightened. How long? He hesitated. I don't know. A sharp pain lanced through her chest. She had just found him. And now, she might lose him. She swallowed hard. Then I don't want to waste today. Marcus's lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to say that. But then, something in his expression shifted, something warmer, something almost tender. Neither do I, he murmured. And just like that, the world fell away again. They spent the entire day together, stealing what moments they could, walking through town, sitting by the quiet lake outside the airfield, talking about everything and nothing all at once. It was reckless. It was foolish. But it was theirs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus turned to her, his fingers tracing over her hand. Sarah. She knew what he wanted to say. She knew because she felt the same thing, because in just a short time, he had become everything. But before he could speak, a sharp whistle rang through the air. It was time. Time for him to go. Marcus exhaled, his jaw tightening. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her close. Sarah's breath caught as his arms wrapped around her, his warmth anchoring her in place. Promise me something, he murmured against her hair. She squeezed her eyes shut. Anything. Wait for me. Tears burned in her eyes, but she nodded. I will. He pulled back just enough to look at her, memorizing her face as if he were afraid he would forget. Then, before she could say anything else, he kissed her. It was soft, desperate, filled with every unspoken word between them. And then, he was gone. Sarah stood there long after he had disappeared into the night, her fingers touching her lips, her heart pounding with a terrifying truth. She had fallen in love. And she had no idea if she would ever see him again. The waiting war. The days after Marcus left felt like an eternity. Sarah woke every morning with the same hollow ache in her chest, the same lingering question, is he safe? Is he alive? She tried to go about her days as usual, but nothing was the same. The town felt different, smaller, like a place that no longer held anything for her. Every step down Main Street, every glance at the airfield, was a painful reminder of what she had lost, of the man who had taken her heart with him across the ocean. Letters. That was all she had. A week after he left, the first one arrived. Dearest Sarah. I don't know where to begin. I've only been gone a handful of days, but it feels like an entire lifetime since I last saw you. The journey across the ocean was long, and though the men around me were laughing and joking, I couldn't stop thinking about you, about our last day together. I don't know what awaits me here, but I promise you this, I will come back to you. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. I will return. Until then, think of me. Yours. Marcus. Sarah clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the words burn into her soul. She wrote back immediately, pouring her heart onto the page, telling him how much she missed him, how much she wished she could see him again. And so it went. A week later, another letter. Then another. Months passed, marked only by the thin sheets of paper that carried Marcus's words across an ocean. Each one was a lifeline, a thread connecting them despite the thousands of miles between them. But war was unpredictable. And then, suddenly, the letters stopped. The silence that followed. At first, Sarah tried not to panic. Mail could be delayed. Soldiers were constantly on the move. Maybe his unit had been reassigned, maybe the letter was just taking longer to reach her. But then a month passed. Then 2. Then 3. And with each empty mailbox, a new kind of fear settled deep in her bones. She checked the newspapers every day, scanning the casualty lists with shaking hands, dreading the moment she would see his name. But it never appeared. Still, the silence was unbearable. By the time winter arrived, she had almost lost hope. The war was nearing its end, and soldiers were returning home in waves. The town square was filled with families reuniting, with women throwing their arms around the men they had waited for, with the sound of laughter and relief. Sarah stood among them, searching every face. But Marcus never came. And there were no letters to explain why. The truth no one would speak. One evening, just as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring returned to Alabama, Sarah heard a knock at the door. Her heart pounded. She ran, throwing it open, only to find a man she did not recognize. He was young, with a sharp jaw and tired eyes, dressed in the same uniform Marcus had worn the night they met. "Miss Whitmore?" His voice was quiet. She nodded, unable to speak. He exhaled, glancing down. "I served with Marcus overseas." Her breath hitched. "Where is he?" The man hesitated. I don't know how to say this." Her knees nearly buckled. "No. Not this. Not now. Not when she had waited for so long. Just tell me," she whispered. He swallowed hard. Marcus went missing in action. It happened months ago. His plane was shot down over enemy territory. There was a search, but they never found him. The world tilted. Missing. Not dead. Missing. A cruel word, one that left hope dangling by a thread, one that offered neither peace nor closure. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. "You're sure?" The soldier nodded grimly. "We waited for news. We hoped. But it's been too long. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He always carried this, he said. He asked me to give it to you if something happened. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was a photograph. A tiny, black and white image of them, taken on the day before he left. On the back, scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting, were 3 simple words. Wait for me. She sank to the floor, clutching the picture, as grief swallowed her whole. The years that followed. Sarah waited. The world moved on. The war ended. Men returned home, towns were rebuilt, and life resumed. But Sarah never stopped waiting. She never married. Never left Alabama. Years turned into decades. Her hair grew silver, her steps slower, but still, she waited. She never stopped believing that one day, Marcus would return. That he had survived. That he had kept his promise. But 70 years was a long time to wait. And then, on a quiet autumn afternoon, just as the leaves began to fall, she received a phone call that changed everything. Miss Whitmore? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. My name is Dr. Evan Ross. I work with a veterans organization that helps locate missing soldiers. Sarah's breath caught. We found something, he said. Something about Marcus. Her hand tightened around the receiver. 70 years. 70 years of waiting. And now, finally, she would learn the truth. The truth that time could not bury. The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's frail fingers. For 70 years, she had waited. Through wars, through the changing of seasons, through the slow decay of time. She had watched the world move on without Marcus. She had watched young couples walk through town, hand in hand, their laughter echoing in the same streets where she had once walked with him. She had lived with the ache of uncertainty, never knowing if he had died that day or if, somewhere, somehow, he had survived. And now, after all these years, someone had found something. Her voice was barely a whisper. What did you find? The man on the phone, Dr. Evan Ross, hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. I'd rather explain in person. I know this is sudden, but, would you be willing to meet me? Sarah's heart pounded. Where? There's a small veterans center near you. I can be there tomorrow morning. Would that work? Tomorrow. She had waited 70 years. One more day wouldn't kill her. But it felt like it might. Yes, she breathed. I'll be there. The meeting that changed everything. The next morning, Sarah stood outside the Veterans Center, gripping the handle of her cane as the crisp autumn air swirled around her. The building was modest, with brick walls and a simple sign out front. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Dr. Ross was waiting for her in a small office, his kind blue eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, pity, perhaps, or maybe something softer. Miss Whitmore, he said warmly, standing to greet her. Thank you for coming. She nodded, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from his desk. Tell me what you found. Ross exhaled. For years, Marcus Johnson was classified as missing in action. No body was ever recovered. No one knew exactly what had happened to him. But recently, we uncovered old declassified records, documents that had been buried for decades. Sarah's pulse quickened. He slid a folder across the desk. This was Marcus's mission report. The last mission he ever flew. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a faded military report, dated September 1945. She scanned the lines, her breath catching as she reached the crucial section. Pilot, Captain Marcus Johnson. Aircraft, P-51 Mustang. Status, shot down over enemy lines. Pilot presumed captured. Sarah's heart stopped. Captured. Not killed. She looked up, her throat dry. You mean, he survived the crash? Ross nodded. It appears so. German forces likely took him as a prisoner of war. Back then, many captured soldiers were never accounted for, especially men of color. Their records weren't always properly filed. Some were lost. Some were forgotten. Forgotten. Sarah's stomach turned. 70 years, and no one had bothered to look for him. She swallowed hard. But what happened to him after that? Where did he go? Ross hesitated. We don't know. Sarah gripped the edge of the desk. What do you mean you don't know? There were no further records of him in U.S. military files. But, he reached into another folder and pulled out an old black and white photograph. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The image was grainy, but unmistakable. It was Marcus. Older. Thinner. His face lined with age and hardship. But his eyes, they were still the same. The photo had been taken in the 1950s. More than a decade after he had been declared missing. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, her vision blurring. Where was this taken? Ross hesitated. In Russia. Sarah's breath stopped. Russia. She gripped the arms of the chair. That doesn't make sense. Ross sighed. After the war, a number of American POWs were secretly taken into Soviet custody. The Cold War was starting, and some prisoners were never returned. Some were forced to work in camps. Some simply disappeared. Sarah shook her head, unable to process it. Her Marcus. Taken. Held prisoner for years while the world moved on. She had spent her life waiting. But had he spent his life trying to get back to her? Tears burned in her eyes. Is he? Her voice broke. She forced herself to ask the question. Is he still alive? Ross's face softened. We don't know. But we have reason to believe that if he did survive the camps, he may have tried to make a life for himself somewhere in Eastern Europe. Sarah's hands trembled. Could it be possible? Could Marcus still be out there, alive, after all this time? She looked down at the photograph again, her fingers tracing over the familiar features of the man she had loved. The man she had never stopped loving. Then she made her decision. I have to find him. Ross blinked. Miss Whitmore, I understand how you feel, but... She held up a hand. No. You don't understand. I have waited 70 years. If there's even the smallest chance that he's still out there, I have to go. I have to know. Ross hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. Then let's find him. The search for a ghost. Sarah sat by the window of the airplane, her wrinkled hands gripping the armrests as the aircraft soared through the sky. The world stretched below her, a vast landscape of mountains and forests, oceans and cities. It had been decades since she had last left Alabama, but she had never hesitated when Dr. Ross told her where they needed to go. Russia. It felt surreal to be here after all these years, in a country she had only ever read about in newspapers during the Cold War. But this wasn't just another trip. This was a search for the man she had waited a lifetime for. Dr. Ross sat beside her, flipping through documents in a folder. We'll land in Moscow first, he said. From there, we'll travel to a small town near the Ural Mountains. That's where the last traces of Marcus's life were found. Sarah nodded, barely hearing him. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the past, on the boy who had asked her to dance that night in Alabama, on the man who had promised to return but never did. She had spent 70 years believing he was gone. But now, she wasn't so sure. The photograph Ross had shown her haunted her dreams. Marcus had been alive long after the war. And if he had survived those years in captivity, what had happened to him after? Had he searched for her, the way she had waited for him? Or had he been forced to forget? A town frozen in time. The train ride to the Ural Mountains was long, and the Russian countryside passed by in a blur of snow-covered forests and abandoned railway stations. When they finally arrived, the town was smaller than Sarah had expected, a place untouched by time, its cobblestone streets lined with old wooden houses, the air thick with the scent of burning firewood. Ross had arranged for a translator, a woman named Katya, who led them through the village, stopping to speak with elderly locals who might remember something, anything, about a foreign soldier who had once lived among them. After hours of dead ends, an old man in a fur hat finally nodded when shown Marcus's photograph. "Yes," he said in Russian, his voice raspy with age. "I remember him." Sarah's breath caught. Ross leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to him?" The old man frowned, rubbing his weathered hands together as if trying to piece together fragments of the past. "He was here for many years. After the war, he had nowhere to go. No way to return home. He was an outcast, a ghost." Sarah swallowed hard. "But he was alive?" The man nodded. "For a long time. But then, he disappeared." Ross frowned. "Disappeared? How?" The man sighed. "One winter, he went into the mountains. Never came back." Sarah's heart sank. Had Marcus spent his last years alone, wandering the cold wilderness? Had he died out there, buried beneath the snow, forgotten by the world? She refused to believe it. There must be something else, she insisted. A record. A grave. Something. The old man hesitated. Then, after a moment, he pointed toward the forest beyond the town. "If you want answers," he said, "that is where you must go. Into the frozen past." The wind howled through the trees as Sarah, Ross, and Katya hiked through the dense Russian forest. Despite her age, Sarah moved with a determination that surprised even herself. She had come this far. She would not stop now. After what felt like hours, they came upon a clearing, a forgotten place, overgrown with ivy and covered in a layer of fresh snow. And then, she saw it. A small, simple wooden cabin. Ross and Katya exchanged glances. Could this have been his? Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving forward, her breath hitching as she reached the door. The wood was weathered, the hinges rusted. But when she pushed, it creaked open. Inside, dust coated every surface, but the room was eerily intact. A bed in the corner, a small table with a chair, an old oil lamp. And then, something that made her heart stop. On the wall, above the small fireplace, hung a single photograph. A photograph of her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the same picture she had sent Marcus in her last letter, all those years ago. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but it was her. Ross exhaled. My God. Sarah reached out, tracing the edges of the photograph with trembling fingers. He never forgot me, she whispered. Katya, who had been scanning the room, suddenly gasped. There's something else. She pointed toward a stack of letters, bundled together with an old piece of twine. Sarah's hands shook as she picked them up. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. But when she unfolded the first letter, her knees nearly buckled. It was in Marcus's handwriting. She sank onto the chair, clutching the letter, her heart pounding. Dearest Sarah. If you are reading this, then somehow, after all these years, you have found me. I don't know how much time has passed, or if you are even still alive. But I have to believe that love, real love, defies time. They never let me come home, Sarah. After the war, I was taken, kept away from the world I knew, from the people I loved. I tried to escape, but the world had changed, and by the time I was free, I was no longer the same man. I searched for you. I wrote letters. But the world is cruel to those it forgets. And so, I came here, to this quiet place, where the past could not find me. But you never left my heart. You were always with me. And if you ever find this place, know this. I have loved you every day of my life. And I always will. Yours, forever. Marcus. The letter slipped from Sarah's hands as sobs racked her fragile body. For 70 years, she had waited. For 70 years, he had searched. And though they had never found each other in life, he had never forgotten her. Ross placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. He loved you, he said softly. Sarah wiped her tears, looking around the tiny cabin that had been Marcus's last refuge. Her heart ached for all the years they had lost. But at the same time, she felt something else. Peace. Marcus had never stopped loving her. And now, finally, she knew the truth. She looked down at the letters, at the words he had written to a woman he never stopped believing in. And for the first time in 70 years. She no longer needed to wait, the love that time could not bury. Sarah sat in the quiet cabin, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The wooden floor creaked beneath her as she traced the faded ink on Marcus's letters, her trembling fingers brushing against words written by a hand that had once held hers so gently. She had imagined this moment for so many years. Finding Marcus. Knowing the truth. And yet, now that she was here, the weight of it all was almost too much to bear. Dr. Ross and Katia sat across from her in silence, giving her time to process what she had uncovered. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it whispers of the past. After what felt like an eternity, Ross finally spoke. "There's something else," he said gently. "Something you should see." Sarah looked up, her weary eyes meeting his. Ross pulled out another envelope from the stack of old documents. Unlike the others, this one wasn't yellowed with age. It was newer, the edges crisp. "We found this in Moscow," he explained. It was among old Soviet records that had only recently been declassified. "We almost missed it." He handed the envelope to Sarah, and she hesitated before opening it. Inside was a death certificate. Sarah's breath hitched as she read the name printed in bold letters. Marcus L. Johnson. Her fingers clenched around the paper. The date of death was listed as 1972, nearly 30 years after he had disappeared. 30 years. Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh wave of grief washing over her. Marcus had lived a lifetime without her. And he had died alone. She exhaled shakily, her shoulders trembling. "He was buried here," Ross continued. "Not far from this town. In an unmarked grave." Sarah's throat tightened. Unmarked. Marcus, who had been a war hero, who had fought for his country, who had survived impossible odds, had been laid to rest in a forgotten corner of the world, his name erased, his story untold. "No," she shook her head fiercely, her grief morphing into something stronger. "That's not right. That's not how this ends." Ross nodded. "I agree." She looked at him, determination flashing in her eyes. "Take me to him." Finding Marcus. The ground was frozen as Sarah stood before the small, lonely cemetery on the outskirts of the village. The gravestones were worn with time, some leaning, others barely legible. And then, there it was. A small, unmarked grave, nothing but a patch of overgrown grass marking the spot where Marcus had been buried. No name. No recognition. Nothing. Sarah's chest ached as she knelt beside it, her aged hands pressing into the cold earth. For 70 years, she had waited for him. And now, at long last, she had found him. Tears slipped down her wrinkled cheeks. "I'm here, Marcus," she whispered. "I came. The wind stirred, rustling through the trees, as if the earth itself had heard her. Ross and Katia stood back, giving her space. Sarah reached into her coat pocket, pulling out something she had carried with her all these years. A small locket. Inside was the same photograph Marcus had kept of her in his cabin, only this time, it was worn with age, just like the hands that held it. She placed it gently on the grave. "You never forgot me," she murmured. "And I never forgot you." For a long moment, she simply sat there, the weight of a lifetime pressing down on her. But then, as the sun began to rise, she wiped her tears and made a decision. Giving him the honor he deserved. Sarah refused to leave Russia until Marcus's grave was properly recognized. With Ross's help, she worked tirelessly to have his military records corrected, to have his name restored, to ensure that the world would know who he was and what he had done. It wasn't easy. Decades of bureaucracy stood in their way. But Sarah was relentless. And finally, after months of fighting, she stood before a newly placed headstone. Captain Marcus L. Johnson. 1921 to 1972. Tuskegee Airman. Hero. Beloved. Sarah traced the name with her fingers, her heart swelling with a bittersweet kind of peace. This was how it should have always been. She placed a bouquet of white lilies beside the stone. "You're home now, Marcus," she whispered. "You're not forgotten anymore." The letter that changed everything. A few days before she was set to leave Russia, Katia came running toward her with an old envelope in her hands. "Sarah," she called, breathless. "You need to see this." Sarah frowned, taking the envelope. It was addressed to her. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was one last letter from Marcus. "Sarah. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to write it anyway. I have spent a lifetime trying to return to you. I tried everything, but the world always kept us apart. But if you're reading this, then maybe, just maybe, fate has finally led you back to me. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Not for a single moment. You were my first thought every morning and my last thought every night. And if there is anything beyond this life, I will wait for you there, too. Forever yours. Marcus." Sarah pressed the letter to her heart, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. The pain of losing him would never fully fade. But now, she knew. He had never forgotten her. He had spent his life trying to come home. And now, at last, he had. A love that time could not erase. Sarah returned to Alabama, carrying with her the weight of both sorrow and peace. She had waited 70 years for Marcus. And though their time together had been stolen, their love had never been lost. She lived the rest of her life knowing that, in the end, she had found him. And when she finally took her last breath, many years later, she did so with Marcus's letter still clutched in her hands. Because love, true love, never dies. And neither had theirs.